This Independence Day will be marked in part by protests, many focusing on police practices. And in that, there's a remarkable connection with the document we celebrate today. A close reading of the Declaration of Independence suggests it's as much about the British Army's unfair policing practices over colonists as it was about taxation without representation. In fact, ongoing demands for fairness, justice, and equality are as old as the nation itself, expressed in protest through the generations.
American protesters have always used the 4th of July as a symbol, particularly the Declaration of Independence, as a way to say to the nation, you have not lived up to your ideals.
Syracuse women's history professor Carol Faulkner.
Pushback is as American pie.
UPenn political science professor Daniel Gillian.
The war against dehumanization is ceaseless.
And LGBTQ activist Matt Reimer all insist our founding is oh so complicated. So how important has protest been in making America what it promised to be?
It's fundamental.
It's important to kind of define what we mean by protest. Queer existence, at least visible queer existence, is in and of itself protest.
How do marginalized groups like women, like African Americans, get a voice in this nation? It's through protest.
Rebellion broke out 5 years before the Revolutionary War, 6 years before independence was officially declared.
All of the issues that we're still grappling with now were an issue in the American Revolution. What is the place of Black people? What is the place of women in the country and people who do not necessarily fit the mold?
The way they spoke about their freedom while at the same time keeping blacks enslaved here was sort of a conflicting conundrum.
That original sin, preserving the institution of slavery, provoked some of the first protest movements from slaves and abolitionists alike, and pushback was fierce.
And violent repercussions for those activists. The best example is in 1838, Pennsylvania Hall. Abolitionists had to build their own building so they could have somewhere to speak. And a mob of over 10,000 people surrounded it the first week it was built and burned it to the ground when Black and white women were holding a convention inside to talk about the abolition of slavery.
But while violence has so often been used to suppress calls for change, it's also been employed by the change agents themselves. What role has violent protest played in this country?
I always say that nonviolent protest brings about awareness, and violence in protest brings about urgency, where individuals have to focus in and pay attention to these concerns.
I would give the example of John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry. Anti-slavery movement had been struggling for decades, and John Brown concludes with his allies that only violence, only a direct attack on slavery, and it did not succeed. But he was also a martyr to the cause.
Even before it succeeded, the fight against slavery gave birth to another liberation movement, when women were barred from the World Anti-Slavery Convention of 1840.
Within the anti-slavery movement, people thought women should shut up. Politics was not women's purview. They should stay out of it. Lucretia Mott said it's activists' obligation to stand out in heresy in order to challenge the status quo and to call attention to all its hypocrisies and falseness.
The push for equal and civil rights suffered setbacks, but also eventual triumphs, winning the right to vote for women and for African Americans after sustained decade-long marches, the landmark Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, which offered greater access to immigrants and people in other marginalized communities. Still, leaders kept pushing the needle.
King moved on to protesting against the Vietnam War. I can imagine Lyndon B. Johnson is throwing his hands up saying, there's another concession that I have to make.
It was around that time another protest movement shook our world. The 1969 Stonewall riots are recognized as the start of the gay liberation movement. But in fact, the fight for acceptance was underway decades before, as Reimer chronicles in his book, We Are Everywhere, and his social media posts.
We start to see communities organizing. It's relatively small, but it is intense and vibrant, and it builds up into the mid-century. In the mid-60s, you see the first protests out on the street, and what is uniquely empowering, potentially, about our community is that we are everywhere and everyone, every race, age, class, ability.
Because while these myriad movements have come far, they seek to travel even further, as seen after the Supreme Court's extension of employment protections to the LGBTQ workforce last month.
We didn't see the same outpouring of joyousness. It's a huge ruling, but it was almost immediate. There was a response within the community. What's next?
We are seeing progress, but that progress is not to the point that leads to complete equity. I think the American public has come to see as just normal. Double-digit unemployment in the black community, that's normal. Being harassed by police, that's normal. And it comes to a point where protest has to put these issues in the forefront and say, hey, this is not right, this is not fair.
How long is it going to take before we are a more perfect union?
If we were ever content, then we should be worried about ourselves.
You don't have to be Martin Luther King. You don't have to be Lucretia Mott. You don't have to be Harvey Milk, but you might be. And I think what is most important right now is that people understand that they need to stay in the struggle.
And you know, Jeff, those protesters in the 60s really accomplished a lot with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, with immigrants of color in particular. 20th century law and policy prioritized European immigrants from entry and outright banned others, including the poor and those with mental or physical disabilities. And then, of course, came the Civil Rights Movement.
Fascinating piece of history there, Michelle. Nice job.